The I have been contacted by several people in the last few days about who's this guy, John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago. Why is he saying these wild things and getting quoted, and what are the implications of this for the Ukraine-Russian situation and of obviously the rest of the world right now? The issues, the bigger issues, are very parallel to what we're covering in much of this course on global local politics, but he has very different answers. And those are parallel and close and competitive enough that I think it is clearly an interesting way of asking, what are we doing here, and how does this potentially transform one's view of the world and of the Ukraine-Russian situation right now? As this is, I've handled this in various ways. We don't have a section in the syllabus which is separately addressing this year, but what we've done in the past is to sometimes bring in a speaker or a participant who can try to articulate this a little more explicitly, but you're getting this day and night in all the media right now. So rather than trying to duplicate that, I want to move to a little bit higher level to first deal with what he has said, John Mearsheimer, and then to look to assess and interpret it, offer an interpretation here, and then invite, third, most important, to invite you to think about these issues and try to make these kinds of comparisons yourself, so that when something else new and especially a crisis situation like this emerges, you can listen to, assess, and ponder how to variously not only reframe, but reframe the arguments in different ways, but second, what policies in turn follow or do not follow because of either your analysis, but most of all, what's in Putin's head, what's in Biden's head, what's in the head of the NATO and EU and other leaders, and how and why do they why do these questions matter very deeply for what's happening on the ground in the Ukraine right now? Okay, why don't we start? I think the best way is to start with the selection we have from a talk that Mearsheimer gave at King's College, Oxford, King's College, Cambridge, February 2022, right now, and it's and if we have about three to 4 minutes. This gives you a striking different perspective from what you get in most of the Western press. Can we play that, Sharon? Yeah,
we now have changed the rhetoric to make the Russians the bad guys. You hear all this talk that Russia is bent on creating the second coming of the Soviet Union. Russia is bent on creating a greater Russia. All right, the Russians are the bad guys. This is a story that was invented after February 22nd, 2014. Nobody was making this argument before February 22nd, 2014. Nobody was arguing that we had to expand NATO to contain Russia before February 22nd, 2014. What happened on February 22nd, 2014 is this cockamamie strategy that we had invented to make Romania, to make Ukraine a part of NATO blew up in our face. And when it blew up in our face because of our flawed policies, we were not going to admit that we had screwed up. No, we had to blame the Russians. So we said they were bent all along on dominating Eastern Europe. And of course, you hear the same argument made today. It's the Russians who are the bad guys. Putin is really dangerous. We can't negotiate with him. This is the equivalent of Munich, which is another way of saying he's the second coming of Adolf Hitler, and making a deal on Ukraine is like making a deal on Czechoslovakia in October 1938. This is all pure unadulterated nonsense, right? Again, there was no threat from Russia before February 22nd, 2014. It just wasn't. We invented that story. But anyway, what the ideal situation would be to create a neutral Ukraine, a Ukraine that looked a lot like the Ukraine that existed between 91 and 2014. But we can't do that. And we can't do that in large part because the Americans are unwilling to make any sorts of concessions on NATO expansion. And furthermore, to make neutrality work, to create a neutral Ukraine, it's very important that the Ukrainian government in Kiev reach some sort of modus vivendi with the Russian-speaking population in the Donbass. This is the famous Minsk Accords, right? It's imperative that the Kiev government implement the Minsk Accords so that the civil war, and it is effectively a civil war between the people in Donbass and the people in Western Ukraine, that has to be settled before this problem can be solved. But the politics inside of Ukraine at this point in time make that impossible. And again, as I said, it's impossible to envision President Biden at this point saying that he's going to give up on NATO expansion. So the end result is this crisis is going to go on and on. That's the sad truth, in my humble opinion. So with that, I'll stop talking, Tom, and turn it over to you.
Okay, good. Has anybody heard a Western observer say those things before? All right, he's very unusual. What leads to these views which he's articulating here? He's now considered, and this is from a bit from Wikipedia, the leading proponent of offensive realism. The structural theory, unlike the classical realism of Hans Morgenthau, USC faculty here earlier in IR, places the principal emphasis on security competition among great powers within the anarchy of the international system, not on the human nature of statesmen and diplomats. In contrast to another structural realist theory, so listen to that, statesmen and diplomats, these are elites, and it doesn't depend on what's in their heads. No mention of citizens, no mention of the media, no mention of civic activities like Tocqueville, etc. In contrast to another structural realist theory, the defensive realism of Kenneth Waltz, offensive realism maintains that states are not satisfied with a given amount of power, but seek hegemony for security because the anarchic makeup of the international system creates strong incentives for states to seek opportunities to gain power at the expense of competitors. Mearsheimer summarized that view in his 2001 book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. Quote from Mearsheimer: given the difficulties of determining how much power is enough for today and tomorrow, great powers recognize that the best way to ensure the security is to achieve hegemony now. thus eliminating any possibility of a challenge by another great power. Only a misguided state would pass up an opportunity to be the hemagon in the system because it thought it already had sufficient power to survive. He also dismisses democratic peace theory, which claims that democracies never or rarely go to war with each other. Okay, basically, what else does this sound like? All political systems are imperialist, he's claiming here, in seeking domination everywhere. They all want to be totally dominant. There's no what we saw before in reviewing the elite theories from others in the 19th century. This goes back to Darwin. We find in a little more specificity, if you read what he has to say, there really is the things which the political leaders of the global system seek to maximize are, and they have, and that is which ones are successful in being in this position. Those with large economically active economies, 1. 2, those with strong military force, and 3, those that are nearby the other countries which are in their potential sphere of challenge or orbit or domination. Later on, he added nationalism. Nationalism is potentially deeply changing the whole perspective to include something about what is in the heads of citizens. But he in everything that we quoted before says nothing about citizens and nothing about what's in people's heads, especially below a handful of top elites. And in the version of this in Darwin, it's not in their heads at all. Domination is posited as the simple 19th century classic version of Darwinism was animals seek to dominate each other, and the species tend to have different reproduction rates, and the ones that succeed have higher reproduction, and the others get killed off or reduced, smaller in number, and some are driven to extinction in some cases. All right. This is a 19th century theory from Darwin, from Marx, from others. And how and why does this make a difference to what we're doing today? Mearsheimer and I have shared a number of students and faculty colleagues, and we both serve on the International Relations Committee together. One quick point is that what he says about the Ukraine derives the big point, I shouldn't say quick, this is a central point. What we've heard quoted derives very much from his general perspective on the continuing program of a strong realpolitik, of what he calls realism, or in this case, in this version, offensive realism. But in fact, he's not seeking to be real in the sense of looking for evidence, data, or does something fit with something else, logic or science. Rather, it's a listing of 3 or 4 key variables as the main drivers of everything, and leaving out everything else, like ideology, thinking, argument, discussion, posting things on websites, elections, no mention of elections, and more. The idea is that you have more of these. The more of these you have, the more you should dominate, and it's normal and natural and perhaps inevitable that these dominating states come and variously suppress or transform the others. If we look at the Ukraine conflict at this particular time, and this theory about it from Mearsheimer, we can ask how the big ideas from our global local politics course feed into this and potentially transform what he has to say. And the point is, this is not just Mearsheimer. This is a multiple traditions which we've covered in a number of the sections of the course, but they come together in a particularly powerful and forcefully stated version in what you heard quoted, what he said in the video. It's a combination of the Marxist stress on the material, of the material base and the economy, although it was really Engels more than Marx who stressed this kind of economic determinism aspect. Marx was a little more qualified. Second, the Darwinian kind of dominance among animals in the ecological theory sense, that some animals will be more dominant over other species, and particular males will fight each other. The most successful will continue their non-intellectual, non-political, non-consensual domination. And then the third is proximity. This is that you especially want to dominate things nearby you, not paying any attention to the big theme with which we start and which underlies this whole course, globalization. That is, if we have more trade internationally, more communication through the internet, more travel, more cosmopolitan values, overlapping and interconnected processes of all sorts, as we've covered section by section through the course, that undermines the uniquely specific nearby proximity, which is the third key foundation, and legitimating the idea that Russia must have Ukraine with it or against it, or that it be a buffer. Let me mention one or two. Okay. Let me introduce briefly a big alternative which we haven't talked about before, but which fits in here as a big frame that you at least ought to know about. It's global. It deals with the current global situation in broad historical perspective. Robert Bella on the top here, Bellah, Religion and Human Evolution. He also has another book edited with Hans Joas, Joas, who's a Chicago social theorist and sociology appointee, called The Axial Age and Its Consequences. These and a couple of others with Harvard University Press. Okay, the big idea of the axial age and the axial religions that emerged at this point was that ancient Judaism, ancient Greek views, Confucianism, and Buddhism all began and developed some overlapping and very similar elements at roughly the same period of time of 100, 200 years just before Christ. Okay, that's the axial religion idea. It wasn't original to Bellah. Others had talked about it for some time, but he in this book really adds a lot more detail and spent, I don't know, 15 or so years digging all this up and putting it together so that the serious historical, biblical religion, Sanskrit, Indian, Chinese, and other scholars are really saying this is a major work in adding the specifics in showing how these did come together. And in that sense, it's a parallel the opposite parallel, if you will, of Genghis Khan, who heightened the use of force and domination through the horsemen, terror, violence, without stressing the specifics of ideas and certainly not stressing religion. That is, Genghis Khan included, as we mentioned, his followers, like the Roman army, Roman Empire army followers, the Roman army were rewarded basically in more material terms. They'll get more land, they'll get more booty in various sorts if they conquer more territory, and in that way, the Roman army and Genghis Khan recruited more and more local, just powerful and important persons who joined because it was a way to get ahead and to achieve more in relatively clientelist way, rather than saying we must all believe the same thing. Okay, so it was eclectic ideologically because the focus was so much, as with Mearsheimer, on power and domination. So if you, and this was of course the critique which I made, or I showed, was articulated especially by Dahl in stressing how the earlier work on power from let me not get too much ahead of myself. Okay, just to stay with just a couple of sentences. Bella has another book more on evolution, and Talcott Parsons even had an earlier book which made the same core argument as Bella does, that you can treat entire civilizations and entire religions as variously adaptable and successful in doing what Darwin implied you had to have random shocks of people trying things out, doing all kinds of things randomly, because that's the way animals did it. Animals tried to dominate, and evolution was an animal-like process where different species emerged. And Parsons said, no, you don't need to have that. And so what Bella does, which is a serious original update to Parsons in the earlier versions of this, is to go over closely the new developments in evolutionary theory, which have found such things when they drill down and metaphorically using microscopes, using detailed electronic analysis of the nervous systems of ants, of snakes, of different kinds of animals, that many of these animals have the beginnings of nervous system components that make them more close to humans than earlier characterizations have suggested. That is, there are monkeys that will work together. They will do the same thing as a sort of a tribe, or that is in battle, in offensive and defensive and so forth. That is, you don't have to posit or observe, and the observations that get closer do not observe simple individualism and individual monkeys doing whatever one monkey thinks about. You may have, dozens of them working together with a certain coherent, with a clear coherence, which makes it possible for them to be more successful in domination or in something else, getting more food. And in this way, what Bella does with a close review of this kind of evolution, but let me just mention one more, the other obvious big one, which if it's not clear. The 20th century had a huge sort of battle between the 19th century genetic determinists who would say, the the Northern Europeans have a different genetic makeup than do the Southern Europeans, and Lombroso and others stress this. And this kind of strong genetic theory was then fought by cultural analysts of various sort, going from Hegel up to the anthropologist of Franz Boas, who was probably he was European at Columbia University in the US. Basically, Boas really then stressed not only this was bad, it was immoral, it was irresponsible, but he basically said that the mind and the culture of that anthropology stresses is central, comes with a broader perspective which goes beyond the physical domination or determinism. And so this sort of mind versus body is prejudice, especially racial prejudice. Is racial prejudice, and are there racial differences, or how much are they really childlike? How a very newborn child is raised in the first few years. There's a lot of work at the Harris School of Public Policy on this by the founder, by Irving Harris, and he gave the money. He wasn't really the founder, but Irving Harris and others worked on this, and it obviously in the U.S. context is big for African Americans and others. And so these debates, I'll quickly add, were transformed deeply by DNA, the discovery of DNA, that the structure of genes, the maps, the guiding frame, the guiding agenda of genes and how they will develop and reproduce and how your body will adapt or not, was discovered as changeable through how the child is treated and how you're treated as an adult, that we can change our DNAs all the time. And so insofar as the genetic interpretation is not seen as deterministic, but it is interrelated with the environment, that's what Bella and others are stressing, that it's a mistake to try to separate a deterministic random, that is to give a determinism in the early version, the 19th century Darwinian version, does not apply if we look more closely at more recent work. And so then that in turn links with religion. And so seeing religion as a means of extending potentially, and so he has core components in a sense analogous to what we've seen, say, in the Scenescapes book, looking for truth, love, play, legitimacy, these kinds of things, and how they go together in Confucianism and Buddhism and in the ancient Jews and the ancient Greek writings, but also how they vary to some degree. Okay, so in that sense, rather than seeing China is different and always will be because China has a unique cultural, religious, traditional, whatever heritage, he's deeply challenging. Okay, let me add another point of two here. Yeah. The IR theory of Mearsheimer is essentially about resources, as was true of Pareto, Mosca, Hunter, and so forth. Dahl stressed the degree to which these are not, resources are not decisions. Policies, specific policies are made by people talking about ideologies, parties, and other things. Big point one. Big point two is domestic and international relations. I have stressed this perhaps more than the IR people who often will talk about, my field is IR. My big point, and this is not unique to me, but it links to the global local politics course in the way that we're presenting it, is to show there's an interpenetration between things which happen in China and which happen in Ohio and which happen at the citizen level, as well as the leader level at the local level, like a mayor. And what the mayors do in Ohio or in China in handling COVID is not totally determined by what happens in, or what is prescribed in Beijing or in Atlanta or Washington, D.C. And then, of course, some of those policies say, let's let the citizens decide if they want to wear masks or not. That mask example is an illustration of the degree to which these kinds of things, illustrated by all the COVID policies, are, next big point you've heard many times in this course, multi-causal, multivariate. And then the question is, how important are each of these kinds of potential challenges, such as the amount of risk, the particular strain of COVID, or the type of bombing that the Russians may use in one city? The city part of this course as well is at least as to present, I won't say anything about the future, but the Ukrainian cities have not been attacked or successfully occupied by the Russians. They can cover a lot of land, but cities are different, and cities are different not just because they are geographically dense and have things which are where you can have people hiding and setting off bombs and so forth, which makes cities harder. On the other hand, the Russians in Syria and other parts in the Middle East, they just, they'll bomb a city to bits, and they've done that repeatedly, ignoring quote the civilian versus military personnel in violation of the human rights kind of distinction. So in this sense, the human rights definition shifts dramatically if you include these non-democratic kinds of perspectives which inform a Genghis Khan or a Darwin or Mearsheimer in this sense. So the deterministic biologically physically based theories come from studies of animals or atoms, since they've switched over to human beings and social and political activities in ways that remain too abstract and just much too simplistic. If you simply say we have competition, survival of the fittest, domination, invasion, succession, these are the key concepts of 1920s Chicago sociology and so-called ecological theory, which continue to be read today by PhD students here. The challenge to this, of course, we've seen in ways. I'll throw some of this out briefly, and then let's talk about it more generally. In the section on political culture, how do these? Anybody want to give an example of how this connects to or has analogs in the Ukrainian situation? What's one big term which I suggested in the political culture section you really ought to pay attention to, which originated, and I'll give you a hint, in Max Weber's book on ancient Judaism. What about ancient Judaism as a central element which persists today in marking aspects of especially the US national politics, and more traditionally so than in Europe, although the Europeans are come much closer? One word answer. Nobody can take any guess? Moralism. Moralism was introduced. I shouldn't even frame it that way. It's obviously it has elements which go back earlier than the ancient Jews. But the book by Max Faber called Ancient Judaism, which I read you sections from, was a major source and is a major source of defining a moralistic kind of statement, attacking authority, attacking the king. The leader of Israel would be attacked by people in the streets or in front of his home, whatever. And the point is, many, not always, but most of the Israeli leaders, the ancient Jews, did not just automatically kill these moralists, these ancient prophets, and they often were prophets of a general sort of which there were hundreds. The best known, of course, was Jesus Christ. But the style of prophetic, moralistic attack on authority is something which you find today in Brooklyn, especially, where we have John Mearsheimer being born, as were a couple of other political activists. Donald Trump was from Queens, nearby. But the point I'm making, and which we have covered in the class in different ways, is that these are not just national leaders and nations. We find the same kinds of components if we look in citizens, individuals, mayors, in names like Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton versus ISIS, and that these are important differences in how people act in war and in peace. The particular ideals of moralism in this sense were in the reading from Daniel Elazar, and strongest in New England, where we had a migration from Old England and the Netherlands, Switzerland, and how that then connects with and contrasts with the market-oriented middle Atlantic states around Wall Street, and the idea of deals stressed by Trump, with, of course, the South, with the racially based slave system as its economic foundation, and not just economic, but basically cultural and intellectual elitism in the South, in the traditional South. So Seymour Martin Lipset basically uses moralism to go from the beginning to the present for the entire United States history, and suggests that the US is this way. And he then elaborates those 4 or 5 dimensions of entrepreneurship, individualism, egalitarianism, and the like, in ways that Aaron Wildavsky does the same in his work with Mary Douglas. The second half of Wildavsky's career, he really used those 4 types, which included slavery, egalitarianism, markets, and the like, and basically positing conflicts among these abstract types in the whole history of the world. But when we get to the US and its short blip in the broader history of the world, it's basically seen as moralistic combined with the others a bit. But in that sense, the continuing national distinctiveness is stressed by that analysis in ways that certainly change with presidents and change, and so it's both, especially Lipset will stress the degree to which one president is a reaction to the last, and the Trump-Biden drastic shift is one of the most striking recent versions of this, that they're reacting against each other, but the political culture more general framework is pointing out how these connect with the underlying foundations in different regions and different subgroups within the US. And of course, as just to bring in human rights and the diversity themes, these became, that is, when Jimmy Carter started talking about human rights as president, the Europeans said, what is this? Some kind of rural peanut farmer is telling us about human rights? And the classic reaction of most European leaders was closer to what you heard Mearsheimer talk about. We don't want to talk to this guy. We don't understand him. Give us Nixon. Nixon is a kind of guy we can deal with. We understand his politics. Nixon, in that sense, Trump are closer to Putin and closer to Mearsheimer's theory, leaving out the fundamental moralistic components of New England, acting in a more elitist way as in the South, but not with a clear ideological, religious, or let's just say value commitment. In the section on mayors, the biography of Norquist, his book and video that we showed that focused on Milwaukee and how it was focused on engaging citizens as pedestrians, getting rid of cars, closing the freeway so that cars could not get into the city of Milwaukee by just coming off a freeway, and instead playing up a different vision of the city, that this was a deep contrast with Milwaukee's traditional commitment to getting large government grants and having them build public infrastructure like freeways. So clearly we have big differences, which are not just at the national level. We have all kinds of these, which Mearsheimer basically is fundamentally saying. Mearsheimer is not talking about the moralistic concerns of Macron or how he was elected by destroying the previous parties. They're not talking about how the current conservative and liberal and Labor Party is no longer the Labor Party of the worker, the manual labor in England. It's the party, it's the new Labor Party, and it's the party of Tony Blair. No longer, I shouldn't say it is. That is, we have differences among these all the time, but it was so fundamentally transformed in that way that it's essential in many of the actual analysts of how these things work are looking much more closely at what the statements are of individual leaders, because especially on, say, in socialist and communist parties of the world, this is much less predictable than it was. Basically, values, religion, new social movements, diversity, the whole legacy of the 60s and 70s going back to the bohemian lifestyle and the tolerance concerns of earlier years are omitted altogether in the politics of Mearsheimer's offensive realism, so-called. What does not need to be personally deeply committed? One does not need to be deeply personally committed to bohemianism to recognize how important bohemianism has been in some countries and some contexts. That is, I'm not proposing we should or should not do any of these, but if we don't even recognize that these things exist, we're just, cutting off the top of our heads. And that bohemianism is stronger in Protestantism and Calvinist areas, and with individualism, which are weaker in Southern Europe and Catholicism and in Latin America, and weaker still in the Asian traditional religions, where, of course, there are stronger families, and how families were built up more from the continuing tradition, which I'm referring to, of the axial age, combined with I will leave That may be too Chiron to talk about China. But what I'm trying to introduce here, as you've seen through the course, is a comparative proposition in the Max Weber tradition we've talked about, and continuing in Gorski's book, stressing Protestantism, and then the Robert Bellah work, not starting with that, but showing how these do vary in subregions and over time. Other IR theorists, when I've had them come to class, discuss these issues in this course, and suggest that Mearsheimer's very simple listing of variables is okay for some purposes, but it simply leaves out whole classes of other variables which are central and which other IR theorists have been bringing in more explicitly. And so this is where we get students and some of these kinds of people turning to things like scenes and Tocqueville, the regions of Italy analyzed by Robert Putnam, and showing how these domestic differences are also major issues in international relations. So Mearsheimer said nothing, that is, he did talk briefly as if democracy was just, something either that was being used artificially, or it wasn't real. And if you look at some of, for instance, the speeches of Putin, how does Putin explain the protests inside Russia or inside Berlin or Eastern Europe or in especially the Ukraine? How did the Ukraine become part that was, let's say, how did it break with its tradition, which was closer to Russia? What's the general Russian interpretation of this? It's much closer to Mearsheimer, in the sense that most of this revolutionary stuff is imputed as coming from outside. These are foreigners. These are foreign people, foreign money, foreign provocateurs, often left unnamed. Sometimes they'll talk about the CIA, but if you try to look and see, as we've looked at more specific social movement evidence, it's pretty hard to make the argument that all of these things happening in places like Argentina or Hong Kong or whatever are driven by the same kind of global, whatever it is. There's a lot of complications, is what I'm suggesting we've seen, not just in my work, but in the many readings in the many different and distinctive sections of the course by people who simply looked at this more closely. All right, so my quick point is, this is changing the field of international relations, adding these in. There's a party of the international relations group with students and faculty that I've gone to and often talk with Mearsheimer on these things, and then talk separately to the students. So a decade or more back, I would say, how many of the students in IR really follow what Mearsheimer is saying about so-called real IR? And people say, oh yeah, pretty many students do. The last time I asked, about 2 or 3 years ago, it was maybe 20% follow Mearsheimer. That is, the students here, even who are listening to Mearsheimer, are disagreeing with him as one of their own central professors. He in turn has spent more time in Russia, in other places of the world where the strong leader style, the focus on the military, the focus on guns, fits more with his theory. I'm not saying that the theory is the driver of everything, but there's a consistency here, an eclectic affinity, which Weber talked about, which is interesting. Similarly, if you don't pay attention to values and morality, how about things like cheating in the Olympics? I mean, this is a big deal for Westerners and Americans who really boycotted parts of the Olympics in China, and Russia has been boycotted from officially participating by the International Olympic Committee because of the drugs. The drugs are not just individual athletes, they are imposed by the state coaches. This was visible in this brilliant Russian skater who jumped around, circled around 4 times, and then it was brought out that she was taking drugs which were really imposed by her coach, and that this has been okay. Why do the Russians do this when when they get punished? One would think, certainly by the international media and by the Olympic Committee. When you use KGB techniques which you grew up with and ignore the rules of the game that may be more important than the formal laws, you're insensitive to values and norms. And that degree of insensitivity is such that why not cheat? Mearsheimer went to college at West Point and talks about marching with other West Pointers with open, this is not in, I just looked, I was surprised, this is not in Wikipedia, that he went to West Point. And I've talked with him about when he was there, he and the West Pointers were called to New York City to march, and they march with their rifles and their open, sharp bayonets, polished and immediately serious, in the middle of the New York City protests at the time of the counterculture. So they were brought in, and that style of confronting an ideology. At that point, I was teaching the course that had the most readings on Marx, and I had many of those student leaders in my classes at Columbia. He didn't talk about the ideas of Marx. His style today and then was show up with rifles and confront protesters with rifles. Don't listen to the broad, egalitarian, tolerant, bohemian themes, which we find in our maps of subcultures in the US and for the rise of the arts, the West and East Coast, for instance, versus the South, as I showed you in several different maps in several weeks. That is, the East and West Coast have a more artistic, innovative style of aesthetics, where arts can drive jobs in non-arts activities, whereas in the South and in smaller towns of the Midwest, the opposite is true, that the arts tend less often to come first chronologically. If when we look at these data over time and change, just looking at crude measure of changes in jobs. And of course, this links with the discussion we've had of aesthetics and of how the ideas, the specific ways that these get framed in changing socialism and changing communism. So that the communist discussions we're having in the Scenes Academy with the Chinese, I've been very impressed with how much the Communist Party officials from local neighborhood levels will say, we go in and we listen to the citizens. Okay, at the beginning, you can just say, oh, that's hypocrisy. But if we hear it again and again, and then we listen to and see specific actions, this is not the Communist Party of Lenin or of Stalin. Stalin is the hero of Putin. Stalin, and has been restored to a charismatic position in Russia. But there are big regional differences, as I said, within the US, within Russia, and then all the more so inside Poland, Spain, Canada, not only nationally, but between central cities and outlying rural areas. So the rural urban, I've mentioned briefly, as having not just density, but having values that are deeply different. And the people in the cities of the Ukraine are really fighting hard because they deeply are committed to an alternative. The same thing happened within Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Same thing happened as within the USSR. When they had the choice after the Berlin Wall went down, the Czechoslovakia split into a Russian republic, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic as two separate nations. Yugoslavia fragmented even more. Citizens mobilized with the rise of moralism, and from the ancient Jews to present with the NGOs, the protests, the street demonstrations, long before the KBG or the Communist Party. The book on the here is the classic Max Weber on China, Trump's support and stress on strong leaders and domination, not the values of the changing youth and the more educated. The global, national, local comparisons that I brought out with the maps and with discussions of individual cases, and Chicago neighborhoods with the presentations I've made and the examples of Chicago political leaders feature the degree to which these values and specific differences vary. And we contrast this, of course, with the scene's dimensions, especially the whole class, which is omitted by Mearsheimer and Putin largely, maybe not explicitly, not always, but as an explicit category is Max Weber's concept of legitimacy. If you don't care about legitimacy, at least you don't talk about it that way. And then it's okay to cheat. It's okay to use fake news. It's okay to go into other countries and try to, bribe people to work for you, etc. Whereas these become scandals when they're maybe discovered by the World Bank, which started making big grants to the former Soviet leaders. I contrasted the Iraq War of Saddam Hussein, whose army basically deserted in the first serious battles, with Napoleon, whose huge, committed, moralistically engaged army was welcomed in Germany and Eastern Europe for the liberating values of 1789 Paris, which had brought to, or at least sought to bring and destroyed many aspects of slavery and feudalism it carried on from earlier years. Okay, it's 5:31. I've said a lot of provocative things and deliberately trying to get this out, but let's have discussion of any or all of these points. Suzanne.
Oh, I didn't have anything to say. I just turned my camera on.
Well, I bet you got lots to say. How many of you in the last month have spent more than an hour learning or reading or talking about Ukraine? Yeah, we need, how about just turn on a couple of cameras so we can see a few more faces here. Let's just get a little sense of some of this. How many of you talked at least an hour? Okay. So one or two, so anybody has not, anybody just say, anybody who's not talked that is, it's good to see as well, even in the class, as we found when we asked before, what's the name of your mayor? That found at least two people, they didn't have any idea who their own mayor was, not just the name, but what the policies were. And that's information. Anybody else who who is not, that is, how much are you, that is you intellectual active, intellectually creative and activist students, sensitive and because you're taking this course. If you say you and your friends are not talking at least an hour in the last month about the Ukraine, how many of you would say that? Nobody. Okay. How many more than 10 hours have you spent on Ukraine? Anybody? Okay, one. Only one? Okay, well, now that's it. So maybe two. All right, so most of you spent more than an hour, but less than 10 hours. All right, that's something. How many of you have heard something like Mearsheimer before? Okay, Aaron. So a couple of you have. How much? All right. What are students? Yeah, it doesn't have to be. I'm not trying to ask anybody what do you want. I'm trying to ask you to serve more as informants about the USC student body and the conceptions they may have either from the media or from the, let's say, the US mass media, or from very targeted social media, of which there are many different types. So these are now potentially transforming a lot of, or that is, there are so many different things here. Can somebody you bring in, what have you read, or what have your, when you have a disagreement, what do people cite? What are the sources of either arguments or evidence or interpretations? I shouldn't just say arguments. I don't want to say it's only ideological. That's the point, that many of these things are much deeper than just ideologies. Ideology comes from deeper values and religion and so forth. Okay, do we have, do all your friends and people you talk to invent or imply they're inventing all of these things you're discussing? Or do they, I mean, who does, somebody must cite something, or they may say, you know, Fox News had someone who said, whereas NBC, I mean, these are partisan participants. Or when I read BBC, I heard this, or when I mean, okay, has anybody talked to someone who has cited the Russian media and the Russian interpretations of how this is different? No. Okay. See, so okay. So one. All right. Here we go. Good for you, Sharon. We got a cosmopolitan. Here's one person trying to be more cosmopolitan. That is, try to do that. I mean, I'd say right now, especially, listen to what Putin and the Russian media say, because they're much closer to Mearsheimer. So in that sense, if you say it and hear it all the time, you begin to, and so Mearsheimer in that sense is overstating his case and sort of imputing it back to others. But he's quoting, I mean, he's saying we have, that Biden says, Obama said. So he's using those, however, to illustrate his theory, his real factors. They really want, they don't want democracy. They want the oil. They want the military domination in the area. They want the money. They want the economy, and they want domination physically in that arena. That kind of assumption is widely used much more in the Russian media than it is in much of the West. Okay, second, okay, so anybody want to qualify or add any comments elaborating any of what I've just suggested or asked? I'm really asking more. I'm trying to learn from you as well. What are the sources?
I guess I have something really quick just to quickly say is I feel like most of my discussions have actually been about how hard it is to find concrete information. You know, war in the age of social media and such, there's a lot of reports that might not be quite as accurate as they might purport to be when they come out, even from big established media, media places. So that, I feel like that's honestly been more of like what I've talked about with people, is about how hard it can be just to find like good reporting, good and accurate reporting, especially like of stuff that's happening currently, which you'd think maybe social media would be better at, but it's, the same old problems of misinformation and stuff. So.
Okay, good point. Anybody else want to elaborate any of that with any examples maybe? Have you seen conflicts among sources in ways that made you more wondering, about them?
It's not really about a conflict, but I just wanted to add to Aaron's point, because a lot of the conversations that I've been having about the situation have also been about that. Because I remember I don't remember who it was, but I think I heard someone say that it's interesting that we're having a lot of debates on like the accuracy and sort of quote unquote unbiasedness of reports now, because in the social media age, you can very clearly identify that any information that comes to you is going to come to you through a channel, and that channel is going to influence it in its own way. And I guess that's always happened, but it's interesting how we're so cognizant of it now. And another thing that was very interesting to look at was how, so for example, when the Ukrainian president put out that video from his like selfie camera saying, "We are here, we will defend the city," I got a notification from an Indian news app, which was worded exactly in the same way as how they send you notifications when like celebrities upload their wedding pictures and stuff, like, "See the latest post here," which I thought was very fascinating. And we talked about that quite a bit.
Okay. So you may be in a bunker somewhere and didn't have 25 different professional photographers and video people, but and of course, as you know, he was labeled that the Putin said, we want to eliminate this Nazism from the Ukrainian area. And of course, he is Jewish, and as well as a wrestler of some sort. So he's wearing now a T-shirt rather than his suit, which he wore when he made one video. So in that sense, it's a rather all of this is framing. It's all part of the story and part of the engaging emotions with the moralism, which is so powerful in driving support. Let me add as well, the troops were there. The Russian troops were there for over a month. 100,000 troops. They were doing military exercises. We don't know what was going on in Putin's head, but did NATO or did the Germans or say especially the Germans say, we're going to send you some big military aid so you can prevent the Russians from coming in? No. Only after the Russians invaded, basically, or just about at that point, the Germans then have increased their defense budget, and the Germans, the EU, I guess I'm suggesting that there's a moralism today activating the national policies of the EU, which is not part of NATO. The Ukraine is not in NATO. And so there's a moralism which is closer to this longer American tradition in which the Europeans 30 years ago said, oh, that's not European politics. It is now European politics much more visibly in ways that only after citizens and protests and demonstrations, 100,000 people in Berlin, then the Germans say, we're sending actual, millions of dollars, big stuff. Whereas if you're Putin and you're waiting to see, is NATO going to react against me? And they don't react. It wasn't NATO. It was, okay, so well, I don't want to go beyond our evidence, but the quick, simple, the huge reaction right now by the EU getting more and more visibly and emotionally upset is inconsistent with what Putin was thinking about, but it's inconsistent with Mearsheimer's interpretation. Mearsheimer is stressing this accord, that accord by NATO, whereas my point is NATO is not a central actor. NATO does, if you've got a new prime minister in France, a new party in Italy and Germany, that transforms the whole European political system. Okay, so that it's more. Who else? What other issues? Anything you've either seen or would disagree with what I'm suggesting about this big change in Europe by the EU in its mobilization and its potentially much larger substantial engagement than looked as if it was going to happen a week or so ago. That is, it looked to many people so the Russians are just going to, if Russians can do anything they want, the Europeans are not going to. And Biden sent maybe 2 months or so ago, the U.S. will not respond militarily. We will respond with some financial sanctions, and that in turn perhaps change the story. How about our two TAs? I mean, you guys are professionally more engaged with watching this stuff. Any comments you want to add or questions for the rest for the discussion?
No, I was looking forward for the US reaction towards this. Like I was hoping it will be like more than just having sanctions and all. Like I was thinking that they'll do something more on their part, the US government especially. But after the Putin, like he strongly said that if any of the Western countries try to like interfere in this conflict, then they'll have like a severe consequences about that. So I don't know like how did like US respond, or whether the US response was up to date, like appropriate or not. So I always wonder like if US could have done better, or US could have like prevented this, or what US could have done on their part to like have something like a concrete reaction from their side, instead of just like putting financial sanctions. Like they put like all sort of sanctions are being put on like I think Russia right now, because of which there's the international diesel and petrol prices are up and all. But I don't think so it was like the appropriate like stance from US. So
just a quick alternative example that's widely used was that Reagan, some said, and then major leaders around Reagan were actively fighting and heavily investing in spending on the military. That is, it was a huge, increasingly expensive military buildup. And then the Russians basically said, we're giving up. And so some people have credited the amount of military investment that Reagan made in acting as if he was second critical point, he was unpredictable. Reagan had a style that was closer to Putin in that sense than Biden. Okay. So if Biden had said, we're not sure how we'll respond, maybe we'll use nuclear weapons if the Russians invade Ukraine, that would have been a very different story, as you're implying. So I'm not saying anybody should. I'm simply saying there's a huge range of options, and
yeah, I think the same goes with the Trump. Like Trump was also so so unpredictable. He could have said anything like that, like with Trump government. So
absolutely. I mean, Trump in that sense Trump took that page, or Trump and Putin both are both brilliant, unpredictably wild in saying many different things that many others would say, oh, but how can you say that if you're a Republican or you're a Russian or you're a whatever else? Sharon?
Yeah, I have been monitoring Ukrainian crisis quite closely, but I do not want to like comment on that very much. And actually, I am a liberal sociologist, so I'm I highly disagree with Mearsheimer. But anyway, yeah, I because due to the time limits, I would not like to comment on that question. But if you guys would like to keep an eye on the Ukrainian war, I recommend this. I share screen. I recommend this interactive map, which includes more current military developments on the ground. And remember to refresh that page often, and because due to the high volume of visits to this website, it can, crash down sometimes. And I think Associated Press do some fact checks for the social media posts and the videos, etc. So you guys, if you would like to check the credibility of certain military videos, you can keep an eye on Associated Press. And
sorry to interrupt. Is there an easy way for students to find a link to that map that you
okay, I can share that link.
Either share it and or maybe send it out. We can. I mean, that's valuable.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, we can send that out to everyone because not everyone is connected right now.
Mm-hmm. And I also want to encourage you guys to donate to the Ukrainian refugee organizations. I mean, credible organizations that aid Ukrainian refugees, because it is expected there will be maybe millions of refugees pouring into Europe and even Japan, America. So that's it from me.
Okay, and we will hear more of your commentary on Wednesday, 2 days from now, about the social movements which you've worked on in China, and to try to I've deliberately tried to have for years have in this course especially have a Chinese teaching assistant who can say, how do our analyses that we're making have too narrow a European set of assumptions? And how would they change if we were in China teaching this course and with everybody were Chinese? What would be different about the course? So having that and with bringing out some of a non-Western perspective is a great addition for all of you and for me. And I've learned hugely from student participation, and especially TAs and research assistants, and then visiting often we've had visiting faculty, especially from China, about 100 people who've often come to this class and then participated and offered different interpretations. Okay, we're at the end of this hour. We can continue on with office hours, and we'll have the student. If a couple of people. Well, yeah, okay, let's stop this general session now. We can continue, no, we can keep the recording on just for the beginning of the office hours in case there's students who want to raise something with the whole, to keep into the recording for others, which are useful in general, like, specifics on the exam or something like that. But we'll stop the general session now.
Thank you.
Grace, do you have anything you want to raise? Yeah. Are you on mute? Maybe I don't hear anything. Just maybe click unmute in the lower left. Or do you have a microphone? Or I don't know. We don't hear you saying anything.
You can type also if your mic is not working. You can just type what you want to ask.
Okay, yeah, we say, sorry, my mic is something. Okay. If you type something, you can either send it as an email, or if it's faster, maybe that is save the email, save the text as well. So you can send it as an email and we can deal with that afterward if it doesn't come through comfortably here. That we want to respond to you, whatever's on your mind. And or if it's easier for you to record what you want to say, you can send us a recording of a longer commentary or question. Charlotte.
Hi, just a quick question. I heard you mention in the beginning of class that the review session will be Monday of next week. Is the final exam Wednesday of next week, or will it be during finals week?
No, good point. Maybe I made a mistake. Yeah, I mean that's a good point. That the main final exam is not on Wednesday. It's during finals week, and it's scheduled by the registrar. So maybe I misspoke. So maybe we do have another session, which is what Sharon was potentially implying, I guess. Yeah, I think you're right, and that I was wrong. Did any and do either of our TAs have any more on this? I thought I wrote this out, but maybe it was just in my notes to myself if I didn't.
No, I thought like we had a review session for the graduating student, because some of them will be like graduating early, right? So I thought we are talking about that, but yeah, the final will be in the finals week from the registrar only. So yeah.
Okay, so we may have one more session than I had thought, but I'll check that if anyone else has a correction or addition for things to include, we will be happy to consider it. So excellent point. Thank you. Very important.
Thank you. So then when will we find out the exact time and date of the final?
Yeah, that the registrar posts that. It may even be available now if have either of our TAs or anyone looked? I think it's a registrar. I think the registrar has a site for final exams, and so we'll try to look for that as those. That is, they choose it after they know the number of students who are registered for different classes, and they try to not have the students have time conflicts for their final exams.
Got it. All right. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye.
Anything else from you two, or say, or Grace, you have something that you've posted that we could look at?
No, I just had a couple of questions.
Okay,
like about,
yeah, your mic is now working fine, I guess.
yeah, it was a setting that I had to change, and then I got kicked off during the process.
Good.
So, this is more like personal. So I was wondering if I could talk to.
Sure. Now,